People ask me what it's like to watch someone die. They mean well when they ask. They lean forward with that particular expression, a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine empathy. And they want me to say something profound, something cinematic. They want me to tell them it's peaceful, that it's beautiful, that after 22 years I've made my peace with it in some quiet and dignified way that they can carry home with them like a talisman against their own fear. I never quite know how to answer that honestly without watching something shift behind their eyes. So I usually say what I always say, it's sacred work. And I mean every syllable of it. I have never used it as a deflection. I use it because after 2 decades of sitting beside dying people, I can think of no better phrase for what happens in that room. Sar, no more precise description for the texture of what it is to be trusted with the last hours of a human life. But there is something else I have never said out loud. Something I carried around for 22 years in a series of small notebooks that live in my desk drawer. Something I filed away under grief response and auditory hallucination, and the well-documented and thoroughly studied phenomenon of terminal lucidity. Because those were the frameworks I had been trained to reach for, and I reached for them gratefully. The way you grab a railing when the ground shifts beneath you. I reached for them because the alternative was something I was not ready to say. I'm ready now. My name is Dr. Marcus Hale. I spent 22 years as a hospice physician in Western Pennsylvania, one serving 3 different facilities across Allegheny and Westmoreland counties. I have sat at the bedsides of over 400 patients in their final hours. I have administered the final adjustments to pain medication. I have spoken to families in hallways in hushed voices about what the next 24 hours would likely bring. I have watched the light leave people who were terrified, and people who were ready, and people who were so consumed by grief and fury that death arrived not as a mercy, but as one final insult from a universe they had already decided was working against them. I have done all of this. I have seen all of this, and across all of it, across every demographic, every diagnosis, every spiritual background or complete lack thereof, or every temperament and personality and unrepeatable human story, I kept encountering the same thing, a pattern so consistent that it stopped being coincidence somewhere around year 10 and never went back to being one. Almost every patient who was alert enough to communicate in their final days told me the same thing. Not similar things, not thematically related things, the same thing. And I need you to understand what I mean when I say that, because I know how it sounds. I am a physician. I spent 2 decades in evidence-based medicine. I do not use the phrase the same thing loosely. I kept records. I have the notebooks. I know the difference between a pattern and a projection. And what I am describing is a pattern. Whatever comes for us when we die, and I believe with a certainty I did not begin my career with that something does come, it sends back the same 2 sentences. It doesn't hurt, and I'm not far. I need you to understand who I was when I started, before I can help you understand what I became. I came into hospice medicine in the early part of my career after several years in oncology. I had watched patients fight, though I have complicated feelings about that language, the way we frame dying as a battle, as if the people who don't survive simply didn't fight hard enough. I had watched treatments fail the way treatments sometimes fail, and I had watched patients end their lives in rooms full of machinery and intervention. And somewhere in my early 30s, I decided that what I actually wanted to do was the other part, the part after the fighting was over, the part where someone needed presence more than they needed another protocol. My residency supervisor told me I was throwing away a perfectly good oncology career. My mother cried when I told her, convinced I had chosen something macabre. My wife, we were newly married, said she supported me completely and then spent 3 months quietly hoping I would reconsider. I did not reconsider. What I found in hospice medicine was not what I expected. I had expected grief to be the dominant weather, a low-pressure system that never fully moved on. And yes, there is always grief. It is woven into the fabric of the work the way cold is woven into winter. But grief was not the primary thing. And the primary thing was intimacy, not in any romantic sense, something older and stranger and more total than that. the intimacy of being trusted with the fullest truth of a person's existence. People at the end of their lives have nothing left to perform. The social mask we all wear, competence, indifference, the careful management of how much of our real interior we let the world see, they fall away completely at the end. What you are left with is a human being in their most undisguised state, and that undisguised state is not ugliness. It is, in some way I have never been able to fully articulate, a kind of grace. I love the work. I loved it completely, and I love it still. And it was in that work, in that particular intimacy with people standing at the threshold of everything, that I started to notice. The first case I remember clearly was 6 years into my career. Her name was Ruth Calloway. She was 74 years old, a retired school teacher from a small town outside Pittsburgh, and she was dying of pancreatic cancer that had spread faster than her oncologist had anticipated. By the time I first met Ruth, she had perhaps 3 weeks remaining, 4 if she was determined. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, and the illness had taken weight from her she hadn't had to spare. She had silver hair she still insisted on keeping neatly pinned, even from the bed, and she had this habit, automatic, entirely unconscious, of smoothing the blanket over her lap with the flat of her hand every few minutes. The way some people click a pen, and her hands needed to be doing something. Her daughter Carolyn was almost always present. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that settles into family members during those final weeks. Not just tired, but worn through, like fabric that has been washed too many times. Carolyn had it. She would arrive each morning with coffee she barely touched and sit beside her mother and try, in the particular silent way of the grieving, to memorize her. I made rounds twice a day. I adjusted Ruth's pain management, monitored her vitals, talked to her the way I tried to talk to all my patients, like she was still the complete and complicated version of herself. Because she was, the dying do not become diminished versions of who they were. Ruth had opinions about everything. The food, the news, the quality of the afternoon light through her window. She quoted Yeats without warning. She wanted to know about my wife, my children, whether I was happy. She was fully present right up until the last few days, when the medication and the body's own quieting pulled her back from the shore. It was 11 days before she died that she first mentioned Margaret. I came in for the afternoon check. Carolyn had stepped out to the cafeteria. Ruth was lying back with her eyes half closed. In that state, the very ill inhabit, somewhere between this room and some other place entirely. I checked her chart. I was about to leave when she said, without opening her eyes, "Margaret was here again last night." I stopped. I turned back. I knew the clinical literature on deathbed visions. They are extensively documented, cross-cultural, and remarkably consistent regardless of religious background. If patients in the final phase of life frequently report seeing deceased loved ones, the standard explanations involve the dying brain reconstructing faces and voices from memory, the deep human need for narrative continuity at the moment of dissolution. I believed all of those explanations. I had been trained to believe them, and they were reasonable, and they fit. I sat back down. "Tell me about Margaret," I said. Ruth opened her eyes and looked at me with an expression I have spent years trying to name. It wasn't vague or dreamy. It wasn't the particular softness I associated with patients experiencing significant medication effects. She was completely lucid, completely present. "My sister," she said. "She died in 1987, ovarian cancer. She was 51 years old." She paused and smoothed the blanket with her hand. "She looks younger now than she did when she died. She looks the way she looked when we were girls, before any of it happened. Isn't that strange?" "Not strange at all," I said. "She sits in the chair." Ruth nodded toward the visitor's chair by the window. "Usually around 3 in the morning. She doesn't say much. She just sits there. But last night she said something to me." I waited. "She said it doesn't hurt." Ruth turned her eyes to the November afternoon outside, the steel-colored sky, the bare trees. "She said to tell me that it doesn't hurt, that it's not what I'm afraid of." I wrote it in my notes that day. Deathbed vision, comfort type, deceased sibling. Standard notation. I didn't think about it as anything more than that until 11 days later when Ruth died. She had been unconscious for the last 18 hours. Her breathing had become what breathing becomes in the final approach. That irregular pattern called Cheney-Stokes, that rhythm that sounds like the body is pausing to consider whether to continue. Carolyn was holding her hand. I was standing near the door. Then Ruth opened her eyes. She hadn't opened them in 12 hours. She opened them fully and she turned her head and she looked at the chair by the window. She smiled, not a small smile, not a polite one, a real smile. The kind that uses the whole face, the kind that cannot be manufactured, the kind that comes from somewhere below the level of intention. She said one word, not to Carolyn, not to me, to whatever she was looking at in that chair by the window. She said, "Oh, I have thought about that, oh, more times than I could ever count." The specific tone of it, the emotional register. It was not the sound of alarm or confusion. It was the sound you make when you turn a corner and find exactly what you were hoping to find. The sound of recognition, the sound of something arriving that you had been waiting for without fully knowing you were waiting. She was gone within 30 seconds of saying it. I stood in that doorway for a long time after Carolyn had moved to her mother's side. I stood there looking at the empty chair. That night I wrote in a notebook for the first time. Not in the official chart, in a small green notebook I bought at a drugstore on the way home. It was the first of what would eventually become 9. Here is what the notebooks tell me after 22 years. 63% of my patients who were alert enough to communicate reported some form of deathbed vision. That number is consistent with the published literature. I have no argument with the literature on that point. What haunts me is the content. The visions were not random. They were not each unique. Across patients who had never met each other, patients from different towns and different families and completely different belief systems, across age ranges spanning 6 decades, across every relationship to religion, from devoted faith to militant atheism, the same message came back. It doesn't hurt. I'm not far. Not always in those exact words, but always, always those two ideas. The absence of pain, the closeness of whoever had crossed before. I am going to tell you the individual cases because abstractions are easy to dismiss and specific human lives are harder to dismiss. And I want you to understand what I'm describing in the texture of actual human experience. There was a man named Dean Marchetti. He was 47 years old, a former iron worker from a mill town south of Pittsburgh, diagnosed with ALS at 45. He had been a large man before the illness, broad-shouldered, physically confident in the way of people who have spent their lives working with their bodies. ALS had reduced him in ways that humiliated him daily, and he handled the humiliation by refusing to discuss it and refusing to accept anything he read as pity. His father, Carlo, had died of a heart attack when Dean was 32. By Dean's own description, they had not been close in the way men of that generation often weren't. They had not said the things they probably should have said, and Dean carried the weight of that unfinished business in the tightly coiled way people do when they refuse to talk about it. 3 days before Dean died, he told me his father had come. He said it the way he said most things, flat, without decoration, without apology for the strangeness of it. My dad was here last night, first time I've seen him since the funeral. I asked what Carlo had said. Dean looked at the ceiling. His voice was carefully neutral, which was how it got when something actually mattered to him. Said the crossing is easy, said it doesn't hurt on the other side, said he was close. He paused. Said he should have said more when he had the chance. He did not look at me when he said that last part, but his jaw did something it did not usually do. Dean died 3 days later. His daughter told me he had spent his final day asking her to sit with him, which he had not done once in the months before, and that in the early morning hours he had said his father's name to the ceiling with something in his voice that she searched for a word to describe. She said it sounded like relief. There was a woman named Sophia Petrakis. She was 88 years old, a Greek immigrant who had been married for 59 years to a man named Theo, who had died 4 years before she came to us. Theo's rheumatoid arthritis had been severe in his final years. His hands significantly deformed, the knuckles swollen and the fingers turned, and he had been in a great deal of pain that he managed with characteristic stoicism and a great deal of ouzo that his doctor officially disapproved of and unofficially understood. Sophia told me, in her 5th week with us, that Theo had been coming to her at night. She said it the way she said everything, matter-of-factly, the way practical people who have survived difficult lives report difficult things. She had no interest in dramatic framing. Theo sat at the foot of her bed, and every time he came, she said, he would hold up his hands and look at her and shake his head. She showed me the gesture, slow, steady, side to side, and the expression on her face when she demonstrated it was clear. The gesture meant no more. No more pain in the hands. No more. Sophia died on a Thursday in April. The night nurse told me she had been speaking in Greek in the hours before the end, which was not unusual, but that there was a particular quality to it. Not confused, not delirious. Conversational, as if someone were sitting very close. And then there was Tyler. Tyler stays with me differently than the others because of his age, because of the specific cruelty of glioblastoma at 29. He had been a graduate student in electrical engineering, and he had the mind you would expect. Precise, structural, deeply invested in things that could be tested and verified. He had not been religious. He had been raised in a household that was, and he had moved quietly away from that in his college years in the way young people sometimes do, without drama, simply outgrowing a framework. He told me 2 days before he died that his grandmother had been coming every night for a week. His grandmother Mabel had died when he was 11. She had been, by his account, the warmest person he had ever known. The kind of grandmother who had a specific skill for making each grandchild feel individually chosen, which sounds easy and is genuinely rare. He described her the way Ruth had described Margaret. Younger than when she died, as if whatever she had become had shed the specific accumulated damage of a long life in a body. Returned to something earlier. She kept saying the same thing, he told me. I asked what. He took a careful breath. Breathing was effortful for him by then. And he looked at me and said, she keeps telling me she's not far, that it doesn't hurt. He was quiet for a moment. She seems really happy, Doc. 2 days later, he was gone. I want to tell you about the word, because the word was the detail that began to unsettle me in a different register than the visions themselves. Around year 12, I started noticing a pattern in the language patients used in the transitional state. That half-sleep space in the final days where the conscious mind loosens and language becomes less guarded, where words surface from somewhere below deliberate communication. 7 patients across different years in different facilities, in different backgrounds, use the same word in that state. Unprompted, independently, without any apparent awareness they were saying it. Threshold, not door, not gate, not light, not crossing, not any of the familiar metaphors inherited from tradition. Threshold, a word with a specific architectural meaning, the point at which you stand before passing through, the place between one space and another, 7 times. I mentioned it once to a colleague, Dr. Priya Anand, who had been in hospice medicine even longer than I had, a woman I trusted with the parts of the work that didn't sit comfortably inside clinical language. I framed it carefully. I asked her if she had noticed recurring vocabulary in patients' final days. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "There's one word that comes up. I've always assumed it was the brain producing spatial metaphor while shutting down." I asked her what the word was. She said, "Threshold." We looked at each other across a break room table, and neither of us said anything for a while. Now I need to tell you about Joseph. Joseph Ferris was 61 years old, a former Marine and longtime electrician from a town called Harwick, and he was the angriest patient I have ever had the honor of caring for. Joseph's anger was not incidental. It was not a symptom. It was a position, carefully built and maintained over decades, and it had been constructed on genuine foundation. His wife Marie had died of a stroke 8 years before he came to us. Sudden, no warning, no farewell. She was there, and then she was gone. And he had emerged from that loss a committed atheist in the most active sense of the word. not the casual atheism of someone who has simply never thought about it. The committed atheism of someone who has thought about almost nothing else and arrived at their conclusion with the rigor of someone settling a difficult argument. There was nothing after this. The universe ran on physics and chance and offered no consolation prizes. Religion was a story people told because the truth was too hard, and he had decided he was strong enough for the truth, and he did not want the story. I respected him for it without reservation. For the first 2 weeks, we dealt in pure medicine. He asked precise questions, and I gave him precise answers. He was not afraid of his prognosis. He wanted to understand it completely. He was more medically engaged than many of my healthy patients, and I understood this as a form of control. If he could not argue the universe out of killing him, he could at least understand exactly how it was happening. Then his daughter Dana called me in early one morning. Her father had had a strange night. I found Joseph sitting up in bed. Unusual at that stage of his illness. He was looking at the window with his jaw set in the particular way it got when he was working through something resistant. He said before I had fully entered the room, "You're going to think I had a stroke." I sat down. "Last night, Marie was here." He said it quickly, the way you say something when you know you'll regret it but can't stop yourself. I know what it was. I know it's neurons. I know it's the brain constructing what it needs. I'm not asking you to tell me it was real. He paused. But she was there. "Tell me," I said. She looked the way she looked when we first met. We were both 23. She was wearing a blue dress she had when we were dating. This specific blue dress, I hadn't thought about that dress in 30 years. His voice was doing something complicated, working against a tide. She was standing right there by the monitor, and she was looking at me. And she looked happy, Marcus. She looked happy in a way she hadn't looked for a long time before she died, because things were hard there at the end. And we were both tired, and I have always regretted. He stopped, looked at the ceiling. She looked happy. What did she say? I asked. He looked at me then. I had never seen his face look the way it looked in that moment. Not soft, not collapsed, but something in it had changed. The way a very hard surface changes under real and sustained pressure. Changed without breaking. She said, "Joe, it doesn't hurt." He said it quietly, like a man laying something heavy down. She said, "I'm not far." Neither of us spoke for a moment. "I don't know what to do with that," Joseph finally said. "You don't have to do anything with it," I said. It felt real. He said it like an accusation, like reality was a standard he had been defending for 8 years, and something had moved the boundary without his permission, when it felt more real than most things feel. Joseph Ferris died 9 days later. His daughter Dana told me afterward that in those final days something had changed in him. He was not converted. He never claimed to believe in anything, but something had quieted. He asked Donna to sit with him in the evenings, and he told her things he had never said, about her mother, about his regrets, about how much he loved her. He told her once, she said, that he thought he might have been wrong about some things. He did not specify which things. He didn't need to. Now I need to tell you the last story, the one that made me stop trying to explain and simply accept what I was looking at. 2 years before I retired, I was called in during the night for a patient named Eleanor Marsh. She was 91 years old. She had been a concert pianist in the middle decades of her life. A real one, not an amateur. She had performed professionally into her 60s. And even in her 90s, there was something in the way she held herself that referenced that history. A quality of interior stillness, a sense of someone who had spent a lifetime learning how to listen. She had been declining rapidly for a week, non-responsive for 2 days by the time I arrived. But when I got there, the night nurse, a young woman named Bethany, 8 months on the job, pulled me into the hallway before I could enter. She was pale. She was talking, Bethany said, for about an hour. I know she's been non-responsive, but she was talking, and I wrote it down because I didn't know what else to do. She handed me a notepad. As the handwriting was slightly unsteady, Eleanor Marsh had said, alone in a dark room at 3 in the morning, in a voice Bethany described as clear and quiet, like someone continuing a conversation already underway. I know. Yes, I understand. I'm not afraid anymore. Tell them it doesn't hurt. Tell them, tell all of them, that it doesn't hurt and that you're never far. Then silence. Then, I'm ready. I read the notepad twice. I stood in that hallway holding it. Eleanor Marsh had been unconscious for 2 days. She had said nothing coherent in 60 hours. And then, alone in the dark, she had said, "Tell them it doesn't hurt. Tell them I'm not far." As if she had received the message, the same precise words. Always the message that had come back through every pair of lips in every darkened room across 22 years of my career, and had understood that she was supposed to pass it on, that there was someone on the other side asking her to carry it forward, tell all of them. Bethany looked at me with the expression of someone who has opened a door they did not know was there. "Who was she talking to?" she asked. I looked at her. I looked at the notepad. I looked at the door to Eleanor's room. "I don't know," I said, "but I think I do know. I think I have known for a long time. Here is what I believe after 22 years and over 400 deaths and 9 notebooks and a career's worth of evidence that I could never fit inside the explanations I was trained to reach for. I believe something waits. I don't know what to call it. Hopefully I am a physician and I am deeply suspicious of easy naming. I don't know if it's conscious in the way we understand consciousness. I don't know if the visions are literal visitations or some form of bridge the dying mind constructs from the materials of its deepest loves. I am not certain that distinction matters as much as I once believed it did. What I know is that the evidence is in 9 small notebooks and in the faces of 400 people in their last moments. And it points consistently and without exception in one direction. Something is there, and the message it keeps sending back is not complicated. It doesn't hurt. And I'm not far. I have spent years turning over the question of why those 2 things. Why not more? Why not the answers to the questions that actually keep us awake at 3 in the morning? Is there self? Is there continuity? Does anything we built here persist? Is the love we made out of ordinary time worth something in whatever comes after? Why just those 2 sentences? Why just those 2 ideas? Returned again and again across decades and deaths until the pattern was impossible to look away from? And I have come to believe I understand it, because those are the only 2 things we are actually afraid of when it comes to it. When the distance between here and wherever we are going collapses down to something you can see from where you are standing, when the body is completing its final process and the mind is beginning to clear, all the philosophical questions, all the metaphysical anxieties, all the arguments about meaning and legacy, and what happens to consciousness, they recede. And what is left underneath all of them? It's the bedrock fear beneath all the others is very simple. Will it hurt? Will I be alone? Those are the only 2 fears that remain when everything else falls away. And so whatever the dead can send back, if the dead can send anything at all, they send the answer to those 2 questions. It doesn't hurt. I'm not far. I am retired now. I live in a house with a garden I am slowly learning to care for, which turns out to require the same qualities the work required. Presence, patience, willingness to accept that you are not in charge of outcomes. My wife has strong opinions about what should go where. The grandchildren visit on weekends and have no idea what I used to do for most of my life. Not really, and that is fine. I have 9 notebooks in my desk drawer. I have the memories of over 400 deaths, each one singular, and each one containing some fragment of the thing I have been trying to describe to you. I think about Ruth's O more than almost anything else from those years. The specific sound of it, the emotional register, not surprise, not fear, but recognition. The sound of finding exactly what you were hoping to find. I think about Dean's jaw doing something it didn't usually do when he told me his father had said he should have talked more. I think about Sophia holding up her hands, demonstrating the gesture Theo made to show her. No more pain, no more. I think about Tyler telling me his grandmother seemed really happy. I think about Joseph Ferris, the angriest man I have ever sat with in that room, quietly telling me that something had felt more real than most things feel. And I think about Eleanor Marsh at 3 in the morning. She's speaking to someone who wasn't there in any way I could measure, saying, tell all of them. Tell all of them. I sit in the garden in the evenings, when the light is right, and I think about the threshold. I think about the empty chair by the window. I think about what it means that 400 people across every background and belief and unique interior life were handed the same two sentences in their final days and carried them back like a gift they knew someone was waiting for. And I find that I am, against everything I was trained to be, against the discipline and the careful skepticism and the decades of building my professional identity on the bedrock of what can be measured and proved. I find that I am genuinely, quietly, when entirely at peace with what is coming, not because I know exactly what it is, but because 400 people told me something about it, and they all said the same thing.